Nancy Pelosi had always managed to survive everything thrown her way. She'd navigated 2 presidential impeachments, a brutal hammer attack on her husband in their home, her party losing its majority, and 4 decades of intense political battles in the toughest city on the planet. She'd faced down presidents, buried rivals, and outlasted everyone who'd ever tried to bring her down. But she had never encountered a number she couldn't explain, and that was about to change. That number was $280 million. In exactly 23 minutes, a lieutenant colonel, armed with a manila folder and a bottle of water, was set to place that figure on a table before 300 million Americans and demand an explanation from Nancy Pelosi. She wouldn't have an answer, and she would never have an answer again. 4 hours earlier, the queue outside room 2154 in the Rayburn House office building snaked past the elevators, down the corridor, and around the bend into the stairwell. Capitol Police had already deployed rope barriers to manage the crowds. CNN had a chyron prepared. Pelosi testifies on stock trading. Fox, meanwhile, had its own ready. Pelosi insider trading hearing live. Every camera in Washington was focused on that single room, and everyone inside knew they were about to witness history. They just didn't realize how historic it would truly be. Tulsi Gabbard made her entrance at 8:45 a.m. She arrived by herself. There was no entourage, no communications director, and no team of staffers lugging document boxes. She wore a simple dark navy blazer over a crisp white blouse. No jewelry, no pins, nothing at all that might catch the light. She carried just one folder and a single bottle of water. She took her seat, opened the folder, and patiently waited. For those unfamiliar with her background, here's what was important to know. Born in American Samoa, raised in Hawaii, she enlisted in the Hawaii Army National Guard at 21, firmly believing that if you vote to send others to war, you should be prepared to go yourself. She deployed to Iraq, served as a combat medic, returned home, was elected to Congress, served 4 terms, ran for president, eventually left the Democratic Party, and in February 2025 became the Director of National Intelligence, the first female combat veteran to ever hold that office. She had certainly been in worse rooms than this one. She had been in rooms where people were actually dying. And Nancy Pelosi arrived at 9:02 a.m. She absolutely did not use the side entrance. Nancy Pelosi had, in fact, never used a side entrance in her entire life. Instead, she swept through the main doors, flanked by 4 staffers, a communications director, and a lawyer from Williams & Connolly, one of Washington's priciest law firms. She was dressed in a cream Chanel blazer and adorned with Mikimoto pearls. She flashed a smile for the photographers. So she gave a practiced wave to a colleague in the second row, moving with the seasoned elegance of a woman who'd been greeting people in hearing rooms long before most of them were even born. 38 years in Congress, twice Speaker of the House, and the only woman ever to wield the gavel. She had successfully passed the Affordable Care Act, spearheaded 2 presidential impeachments, survived a terrifying home invasion that almost killed her husband, and amassed a personal fortune that easily competed with the very hedge fund managers she oversaw. She settled into her seat, adjusted her microphone, and then fixed her gaze on Gabbard, the way a queen might regard a peasant who had mistakenly wandered into her throne room. And then she launched her attack. Director Gabbard, Pelosi began, not even waiting for the chairman to officially open the session. Her voice steeped in 4 decades of absolute power. I truly hope today proves more productive than your last appearance before Congress. If I recall correctly, your presidential campaign. What was it? 1%? Then you abandoned the party because you couldn't win. You switched sides. Now you sit there in a chair given to you by a man I impeached twice, and you actually believe you're qualified to lecture me about ethics. She smiled then. It was the kind of smile that had, historically, ended careers. I've been through more hearings than you've even had days in Congress. I've stared down presidents who made your boss look like a complete amateur. So, whatever you imagine you have in that little folder of yours, Director, let's just get it over with. Some of us actually have real work to do. Laughter erupted from the Democratic side of the room. It was loud laughter, the kind that surfaces when people are convinced the battle is already won. And Pelosi's staff exchanged knowing smirks. In the press section, several reporters started typing what they presumed would be the headline story. Veteran politician schools junior appointee. CNN's backup Chiron was already queued up. Pelosi puts Gabbard in her place. The entire room was laughing with Pelosi, but in just 10 minutes, they would be laughing at her. Nobody knew that yet, though. Nobody, that is, except the woman sitting quietly at the witness table, with her single folder and one bottle of water. Pelosi, however, wasn't done. She never really was. She could sense the blood in the water, and she smelled it. You know, Director, I recall when you were a part of my caucus, when you attended my meetings, when you voted with my party. And then, when it suited you, when you polled at a mere 1% and couldn't secure a single endorsement, you simply walked away. Not because of principle, but out of pure ambition. So please, spare me this moral authority act. I was fighting for working families when you were still trying to figure out which party would even bother to take you. More laughter, more applause. Progressive activists in the gallery nodded along. This was the Nancy Pelosi they absolutely loved. Sharp, lethal, and completely untouchable. She had done this 1,000 times before. She'd taken down 1,000 opponents with that precise mix of condescension and political smarts. She had no idea she'd just signed her own political death warrant. Tulsi Gabbard, though, said nothing. 15 seconds, then 20 seconds passed. She calmly arranged the documents in her folder, took a sip of water, and never looked up. Pelosi, sensing what she mistakenly thought was weakness, pressed even harder. Perhaps if you spent less time switching parties and more time figuring out how government actually works. Are you finished, Madam Speaker? Tulsi finally looked up, but her voice was quiet. It was the controlled voice of someone who'd delivered worse news in worse places. Someone who'd learned long ago that volume wasn't needed when you had the facts, because you just mentioned service. And I have some questions about how you've served, specifically about how you became very, very rich while serving. The smile vanished from Pelosi's face, not slowly, but all at once, like a light switch flipping off. And she had just made the single worst mistake of her entire 40-year career. She had insulted the wrong veteran, mocked the wrong soldier, picked the wrong fight, and she was about to find out exactly how wrong she'd been. Tulsi then opened the folder. She laid 4 documents side by side on the table, just like a surgeon lays out instruments, each one perfectly in its place, each one with a purpose. The entire room watched, captivated. I want to start with dates and dollars, she said. Not opinions, not accusations, just a timeline. The American people can draw their own conclusions. July 2021. Your husband, Paul Pelosi, purchases between $1 and $5 million in NVIDIA call options. At that time, the CHIPS Act legislation, which directed $52 billion in taxpayer money into semiconductor manufacturing, Here was making its way through your Congress. You were Speaker of the House. You controlled which bills even reached the floor. When reporters asked about it, your spokesperson stated, and I'm quoting directly from the official transcript, "The Speaker does not own any stocks and has no prior knowledge or subsequent involvement in any transactions." She looked up. You don't own stocks. Your husband does. You've been married since 1963. You share a home, a vineyard, and a net worth that estimates place between $240 million and $413 million. The suggestion that there's a firewall between your legislative knowledge and your husband's investment decisions requires the American people to believe that you go home every night, sit across the dinner table from the man you've been married to for 62 years, and never once mention that a $52 billion semiconductor bill is about to hit the floor. A murmur moved through the gallery. It was the kind of sound that happens when 400 people think the exact same thing at the same time. I'll let them decide whether they believe that. Moving on. July 2024. Paul Pelosi sells between $500,000 and $1 million in Visa stock. 17 days later, 17 days, the Department of Justice announces a major antitrust lawsuit against Visa. The stock drops 5% overnight. Your husband was already out. In that same year, your husband sells Microsoft shares. Shortly after that, the Federal Trade Commission opens a probe into Microsoft. Again, out before the news, she turned a page. In 2024, your family's investment portfolio returned 54%. The S&P 500, the benchmark that professional fund managers spend their entire careers trying to beat, returned 25%. Your husband didn't just beat the market. He absolutely doubled it. He outperformed every single major hedge fund in America. Grant Cardone even did the math on your salary. $74,000 a year for 38 years. He said you would need to be 33,000 years old to accumulate that kind of wealth on a congressional salary. Somebody in the back laughed, not cruelly, but in clear recognition. And in May of this year, a stock watchdog reported that you made $4.7 million in a single day of trading. One day, most American families don't make that in a lifetime. She closed the page, folded her hands, and simply waited. Pelosi then leaned into her microphone. Her voice was steady, delivering the answer she'd given 100 times to CNN, to MSNBC, to reporters in hallways, and to colleagues at fundraisers. It had always worked before. "Director Gabbard," she said, nothing you've said is new, and nothing you've said is illegal. My husband is a successful businessman. His decisions are entirely his own. Every trade was disclosed under the Stock Act. Every single filing was on time. If you have actual evidence of a crime, refer it to the Department of Justice. Tulsi nodded slowly. You're right. Everything was disclosed after the profit. Not before the trade. But let's talk about the timing. She reached back into the folder and pulled out a small digital recorder. She held it up so every single camera could clearly see it. This is a recording from a phone call between your congressional office and your husband's investment advisor. December 16, 2021, 3 days before the NVIDIA purchase. She then pressed play. The voice that then came out of the speaker was utterly unmistakable. After 4 decades in public life, every American recognized that voice. It was Nancy Pelosi's voice, captured right there in her own office. Paul, the Intelligence Committee briefing on semiconductors just concluded. The CHIPS Act will reach the floor before March. Let's adjust our positions before Tuesday's vote. 15 seconds of silence followed. It was the kind of silence where you could almost hear 300 people collectively holding their breath. Tulsi then stopped the recording. That was your voice, Madam Speaker, originating from government servers, authenticated, time-stamped, and acquired through a lawful interagency review. Pelosi's expression remained unchanged, yet her hands, previously folded, subtly shifted to the table's edge. Her lawyer, from Williams and Connolly, gently touched her arm, but she pulled it away sharply. That recording? It's been manipulated. Manipulated! Tulsi's voice stayed level. I confirmed by government servers and authenticated by the NSA's Digital Forensics Division. Would you like me to play the second recording? The one regarding Taiwan? Pelosi remained silent. Can you explain the timing of this, Madam Speaker? 17 days before the visa lawsuit, and just 3 days after this phone call regarding NVIDIA. Every single time your husband makes a move, the news breaks almost immediately after. 4 seconds of silence hung in the air. In a hearing room, 4 seconds can feel like an eternity. I believe I've answered your question, Director. No, Madam Speaker. You've certainly answered a question, but just not the one I asked. The press section was furiously scribbling notes. 2 reporters were already filing their stories from their phones. In the gallery, a man in a gray suit leaned forward and murmured to the woman beside him, "She really doesn't have an answer for the timing, does she?" And he was right. She simply didn't. Everyone in the room knew it, too. What happened next would become the topic of conversation, even more than the numbers, the recording, or the visa trade. They'd especially talk about the exact moment Tulsi Gabbard stopped reading from her folder and began speaking from memory. She deliberately pushed the documents to the side. Not with any drama, she just moved them aside, much like you'd clear a plate when you're finished eating. And when she finally looked up, her gaze wasn't fixed on Pelosi. Instead, she was looking directly into the camera. I want to share a story about a man I served alongside. I've changed his name to protect his privacy, but I assure you, he is very real. And this story, too, is real. Sergeant First Class Keon Reyes was part of my unit during my second deployment. A medical unit, specifically. We were responsible for processing soldiers returning from patrols, dealing with IED injuries, gunshot wounds, and heat casualties. These are the things you don't typically see on the news, simply because they occur every single day. Keon truly was one of the finest medics I ever had the privilege to serve with. He was always calm under fire. He never complained. He was the kind of soldier who inspired everyone around him to be better. When we returned home, he heartbreakingly discovered his daughter had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes while he was deployed. She desperately needed insulin. However, his VA benefits were stalled due to a paperwork backlog. So he was forced to pay out-of-pocket $400 a month, all on a sergeant's salary. Her voice hadn't altered. She was still the composed briefing officer, yet something deeper had shifted, like the temperature plummeting before a storm. I sat with him in the parking lot, just outside the VA clinic in Honolulu. He was doing quick math on his phone. Insulin versus rent. Here was a combat medic who had just dedicated 12 months to keeping soldiers alive, now sitting in a parking lot, agonizing over whether he could afford to keep his own daughter alive. She then looked directly at Pelosi. That very same month, the exact month your husband exercised NVIDIA call options at $12 a share, even though the market price was 10 times that. The profit from that single transaction alone amounted to nearly $5 million. The entire room fell silent. Not the polite, expectant silence typically found in a hearing room between questions, but rather the heavy silence of people who had just heard two stark facts laid out side by side. And they simply couldn't reconcile them, couldn't make them both acceptable. $5 million from one trade. Just while a soldier who had proudly served his country couldn't even afford $400 a month for essential insulin. She paused deliberately. I'm not suggesting these two things are legally connected. In fact, they're not. Your husband's trade was perfectly legal. Hyun's insurance delay was purely bureaucratic. On paper, they literally have nothing to do with each other. But in the real world, the world where soldiers return home struggling to get vital medicine, and while their congresswoman's husband makes $5 million on a stock that surged because of a bill she personally controlled, in that world. Madam Speaker, they have absolutely everything to do with each other. Pelosi's communications director, who had been seated in the second row, abruptly stopped typing. The lawyer from Williams and Connolly slowly put his pen down. These were professionals paid good money to always appear busy. But now, they had simply stopped being busy. I'm sorry for your colleague, Pelosi finally said. Her voice was distinctly softer now, almost unnervingly careful. But this hearing is fundamentally about stock trading disclosures, not military health care. No, Madam Speaker, it's about trust. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it even worse. It's about whether the American people can truly trust that the very individuals who write our laws aren't simultaneously profiting from them. And right now, today, said the undeniable answer is no. Nobody dared to speak. Not the chairman, not the members, not even a soul in the gallery. The only sound in the room was the click-clack of the stenographer's keys, capturing every single word for a transcript that would rack up 400,000 downloads before the night was over. This was the very moment people would later point to, saying it changed absolutely everything. Not because of the big numbers, but because of the chilling silence that fell afterward. For it was the silence of 300 people who had just seen the true human cost of $280 million. But then, insider trading wasn't even the gravest accusation waiting in this folder. Madam Speaker, the whole room, which had just begun to slowly relax after the insulin story, suddenly tensed up once more. Tulsi reached back into the folder and carefully pulled out a document, prominently displaying the seal of the National Security Council. The classification markings were blacked out, but there was no mistaking that distinctive seal. Let's talk about Taiwan. Pelosi's lawyer leaned forward, looking concerned. Mr. Chairman, if this involves classified information, Tulsi stated, cutting him off, it was declassified as of last Tuesday. Funny how that works, right? She then laid the document flat on the table for everyone to see. The date, August 2nd, 2022. You chose to fly to Taiwan, completely ignoring the clear advice from the Pentagon, the State Department, to the National Security Council, and even the President of the United States. Every single military advisor had warned that your visit would spark a crisis with China. Every intelligence briefing painted a grim picture: missile tests, large-scale military exercises, potential shipping lane closures, and serious market instability. Yet, you went anyway. She then looked directly at Pelosi. Why? Pelosi sat up straighter in her chair. That trip, she declared, was about defending democracy and upholding Taiwanese sovereignty against Chinese aggression. Then why, Tulsi pressed, did your husband purchase shares in defense contractors, alternative shipping companies, and rare earth mineral suppliers? This question, delivered just 3 weeks before Pelosi's departure, hit the room like a live grenade. Pelosi's mouth opened, then closed, then opened once more, unable to form words. I'm holding a classified briefing summary right here, a now declassified, dated July 11, 2022. That's 3 weeks before your Taiwan trip. This briefing spelled out precisely how Beijing would react to a high-level American visit. Missile tests near Taiwan, massive military exercises, market jitters in semiconductor and defense stocks, and possible disruptions to Pacific shipping. Tulsi then carefully placed the briefing summary right beside Paul Pelosi's trading records. Every single predicted response, every stock your husband acquired, and it was a perfect, undeniable match. He didn't just have a hunch a crisis was brewing. He knew the exact nature of the coming crisis, because you told him. Because you were privy to that classified briefing. She made sure to turn the documents so the cameras could clearly capture them. Your husband's portfolio, she underscored, was strategically set up to profit from a military confrontation between nuclear powers. This wasn't some market hunch or a stroke of luck. It was a classified prediction of exactly what would unfold and precisely how to cash in on it. She then produced the recorder once more. There's a second recording, she announced. Same phone line. July 14th, 2022, just 18 days before your Taiwan trip. She pressed play. Pelosi's voice filled the room again. Paul, the voice said, the Taiwan situation is going to get hot. Beijing is planning military exercises because of our semiconductor restrictions. Make sure you're properly positioned in defense contractors and those regional stability plays. And Paul, delete these calls from the log. The room was so incredibly silent that the air conditioning now roared like a jet engine. Delete these calls from the log, Tulsi repeated, her voice cutting through the quiet. You knew what you were doing needed to be hidden. For your photo op. A friend of mine was for your photo op. A friend of mine was stationed at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. He told me that the moment your plane entered Taiwanese airspace, his entire unit immediately shifted to DEFCON readiness. His wife was home, in base housing, with their 2 young children. She didn't sleep for 3 straight days, so she had a go bag packed and waiting right by the door. That military spouse was making ready to evacuate with her kids, all because of a crisis you planned for, not planned to prevent, but planned to profit from. That's not just insider trading. That's not mere corruption. That is a profound betrayal of every single man and woman who has ever proudly worn this country's uniform, trusting that those in power wouldn't gamble with their lives for profit. Pelosi slowly reached for her water glass. Her hand was trembling. It was visibly shaking on camera. The water sloshed right over the rim, pooling on the polished mahogany table. She placed the glass back down without taking a single sip. Her lawyer quickly leaned in, attempting to whisper something to her. She subtly pushed him away. That trip was about standing up to China, she insisted. That trip, Tulsi countered, made your husband $3 million in just 2 weeks. If that's what standing up to China looks like, Madam Speaker, then your portfolio certainly has a very unique definition of patriotism. Pelosi opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in her 40 years of public life, her own body was utterly betraying her. All the cameras, every single one, zoomed in tight on her hands, which were now visibly trembling. The most powerful woman in Washington, and her hands just wouldn't stop shaking. The chairman quickly called for a 5-minute recess. He might as well have announced a ceasefire in a war that, for all intents and purposes, was already completely over. Nancy Pelosi's career had a mere 23 minutes left. She just didn't know it yet. When the hearing started back up, 2 seats on the Democratic side of the dais were empty. No one said where those members had gone. No one really needed to. And Tulsi then picked up the last document in her folder. This was a bill introduced by Senator Josh Hawley. It was called the Pelosi Act, PLOSI, the Preventing Elected Leaders from Owning Securities and Investments Act. She let that name just hang in the air. Congress actually named an anti-corruption bill after you, Madam Speaker. Not the Stock Trading Reform Act, and not the Congressional Ethics Bill. No, it was after you personally, because your trading activity became so notorious that your name was now synonymous with the problem. Senator Hawley, a Republican, and Senator Bernie Sanders, a progressive independent. Even Senator Fetterman, a Democrat. 3 men who agreed on almost nothing, all agreed on this. What you've been doing here needed to stop. And it wasn't just Congress. There were even apps, actual mobile applications, that would send push notifications to investors every time your husband made a trade. The tens of thousands of people actually paid money to copy your portfolio. There was an ETF with the ticker symbol NCD that tracked Democratic congressional trades. It was even outperforming the market. The American people had turned your corruption into a financial product. They'd given up on the idea that you would ever stop. So, instead, they'd decided to just profit from it. That wasn't oversight, Madam Speaker. That was surrender. Back in 2011, 60 Minutes investigated congressional insider trading. And you were featured. Steve Croft asked you directly if you had an unfair advantage. You just said no. You looked him right in the eye and said no. In 2012, Congress passed the Stock Act to prevent exactly this kind of trading. You even voted for it. You stood at the signing ceremony. You smiled for the cameras. And in the 13 years since that law was supposed to stop you, your family's net worth went from $31 million to somewhere north of $280 million. You voted for that law. You posed for the photo. And then you treated it just like a starting gun. In 2025, the President of the United States stood before Congress and called for the passage of the Stop Insider Trading Act. He looked out at the chamber and said, and I'm quoting, "Let's ensure that members of Congress cannot corruptly profit from insider information." Both parties stood and applauded. And then the President said, "Did Nancy Pelosi stand up? I doubt it." Tulsi looked at Pelosi. "Did you stand up, Madam Speaker?" "I stood. I did. I applauded. And I will continue to support transparency." Then put your assets in a blind trust. Today, right now, just end this. You could end every single question about NVIDIA and Visa and Microsoft with just one signature. You've been asked to do it for 13 years, by reporters, by colleagues, by your own staff, and you've refused every single time. Why? Because a blind trust means you can't see the trades, and you can't profit from what you can't see. Pelosi said nothing. Something happened then that no one expected. A Democratic congressman actually stood up. It was Mike Thompson from California. He had sat behind Pelosi for 12 years, voted with her on everything, defended her on cable news, and even called her a mentor. "Mr. Chairman," his voice was shaking. The whole room went quiet. Democrats didn't break ranks against Pelosi. That was just the rule. For 40 years, that was the only rule that ever mattered. I need to say something. I voted against Stock Act reform 3 times, because leadership asked me to, because she asked me to. She called me personally. She said reform would hurt the party. She said the trades were legal, and the media would just move on. He looked at Pelosi. His eyes were wet. The media didn't move on. The American people didn't move on, and I really should not have listened. And the people of California's 4th District sent me here to serve them, not to protect anyone's portfolio. I'm ashamed that I didn't say this years ago. I'm saying it now. He sat down. His hands were shaking almost as badly as Pelosi's. The entire hearing room held its breath. In 40 years of congressional politics, Nancy Pelosi had never, not once, been publicly betrayed by a member of her own caucus on live television. She had survived Republican attacks, media investigations, and even presidential confrontations. She had never been stabbed by her own side, not once, not ever, until now. She turned to look at Thompson, and the expression on her face. The cameras caught it. The analysts would study it for weeks. It was not anger. It wasn't contempt. It was pure shock. Pure, unprocessed shock. It was the face of a queen watching her own guard turn the sword around. I have served this country for 38 years, Pelosi began, her voice cracking for the very first time. And you left Congress $277 million richer than when you arrived, Tulsi said, all on a salary of $174,000 a year. That's not service, Madam Speaker. That's commerce. Pelosi gripped the table. Her knuckles were white. She tried to stand, some instinct from 40 years of power, some reflex that said, stand up, take control, own the room. But her legs just did not cooperate. She sank back into her seat, the chair screeching loudly against the floor. A sound the microphones caught, and one that would be replayed 10 million times before morning. Her lawyer quickly reached for her arm. This time, she didn't pull away. She clearly needed the support, and everyone in the room could tell. The hearing had originally been scheduled for 3 hours, but they were now well into the 4th. The chairman had long since given up pretending he was in charge. Online viewership had already surpassed 800,000, setting a new record for a committee hearing. A staffer whispered to the chairman that the White House had called him twice. Tulsi then closed her folder. She carefully set it aside. When she finally looked up, her hands rested flat on the table. There was nothing in them. Absolutely nothing stood between her and the microphone now. I want to finish with something that isn't about stocks, or trades, or timelines. The entire room seemed to shift. Support and defend the Constitution. You raised your right hand and swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. You were 46 years old then. You had 5 children. You truly believed in something. I truly believe you meant that oath, Madam Speaker. I believe the woman who stood in that chamber back in 1987 genuinely wanted to serve. But somewhere between then and now, something fundamentally changed. I don't know the exact trade, or the exact vote, or the exact moment that oath stopped being a sacred promise and started being a mere formality. No, but the numbers are crystal clear. You entered Congress with a net worth of $3 million. You will leave with a net worth exceeding $280 million. That's not a congressional salary. That's not a pension. That's not even a book deal. That is what happens when someone spends 4 decades at the crossroads of information and money, and then treats the distance between them as nothing more than a suggestion. I, myself, took my oath twice, once for Congress, and once for the Army. That second oath didn't come with a stock portfolio, you know. It came instead with a deployment to Iraq, a bunk bed, and a rucksack that weighed 65 pounds. You served 38 years in Congress. I served 3 deployments in a combat zone. You left office worth $280 million. I left Iraq with a combat medical badge and just a duffel bag. The difference between us isn't about party. It isn't about ideology. It isn't even about age. It's simply the price. Everything I have, I physically carried myself. Everything you have, you traded for. She then stood up. Thank you, your Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have nothing further to add. She picked up the folder, the very one she hadn't touched for the last 20 minutes, and began walking toward the door. Behind her, the entire gallery erupted. It wasn't the hesitant, polite applause you usually hear at a congressional hearing. No, this was the real deal, the sound of 300 people who had been holding their breath for 4 long hours, finally given permission to exhale. So the chairman slammed his gavel once, then twice, then a third time. It simply didn't matter. Some sounds are just bigger than any gavel. Nancy Pelosi, however, remained seated in her chair. She didn't move a muscle. Her lawyer was already closing his briefcase. Her communications director was already out in the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, using the word reframe in every single sentence. Pelosi attempted to stand up, but her legs failed her once again. The lawyer gently took her arm. A staffer took her other arm. On live television, broadcast to 800,000 viewers, and still climbing, the most powerful woman in Washington had to be visibly helped out of her chair. She managed 3 steps before she stopped and turned back toward the room. The cameras zoomed in on her face, and what they captured wasn't anger, nor defiance, nor even the predatory smile she'd worn just 4 hours earlier when she walked in. Instead, it was the face of a woman who had just witnessed 40 years of power crumble in 4 short hours, and who understood with absolute clarity that nothing she had ever built could possibly survive what had just transpired. She finally turned away. Her staff gently guided her towards the door. She chose not to use the side entrance. Nancy Pelosi never used side entrances, not even on the very last day of her long career. That clip absolutely broke the internet before lunchtime. See, it wasn't the oath speech, nor the insulin story, nor even the Taiwan revelation, even though the recording of Pelosi's voice telling her husband to adjust our positions before Tuesday's vote would become the most played audio clip in C-SPAN history within 48 hours. The clip that truly went viral, the one that turned into a GIF, a meme, and the thing your uncle texted you at 11 p.m. with absolutely no context, was that timing exchange from Chapter 2. Can you explain the timing? 17 days. Pelosi's hands slowly moved to the very edge of the table. I've answered your question, Director. No, Madam Speaker. You've certainly answered a question, just not the specific one I asked. That exchange garnered 26 million views in just 48 hours. A college student in Arizona even auto-tuned it. That version got 11 million views. A financial analyst on YouTube meticulously broke down every Pelosi trade alongside legislative events, titling his video 17 Days, which then got 9 million views. The Pelosi Tracker app reported an astonishing 300% surge in downloads. But then, for the first time in 3 years, it saw an equally astonishing 300% surge in deletions. People no longer wanted to simply follow her trades. Now, they wanted her prosecuted. The Taiwan recording, incredibly, became even bigger. Delete these calls from the log immediately became its own viral hashtag. Trong vong hai moi bon gio, semotit nhathiet ke jo hoa o Brooklyn jantaura mot poster, voi huon mat kua Pelosi, lako mai fia so ko e, vasau tu fia doi. Soan hong kwach goi nai koin hatki. Nojan juok taik suong het triulan. Fox News jafat tuan bo bay, pat buket tuchmak hong kat gep. Chian Hannity hong thembin luan. Chief at song Nova Jamai Kwe Dong Lai Tren Kwon Matan Hata. Jiu Ju Anta Noi. Lali do ko Iroi Koi Jang Va Jo Lali do Ho So Ko A. On Ben Shapiro Goi Jo Laloi Kai Kwak Hoi Hio Kwan Hat Trong Lich Su Hien Jai. Valu Irang Gabar Chua Bao Gio Lon Tieng. Ko Ai Kong Kan Fai Lam Vei. Antanoi Ko Ai Ko Bang Chung. Tucker Carlson Jan Dant Ba Jem Lien Tiep Cho Fien Jiu Tran. Jem Jiao Tien Ve Kats Giao Dik. Jem Thu Hai Ve Su Fan Boy Jai Loan. Jem Thuba Mot Kuok Fong Van Jai Juvoi Mot Nha Fan Tichnes A Ja Ninghi Hu. Angoi Ja Sach Han Kats Bang Hi Amjien Thoai Fu Hop Voi Kats Giao Thuk Chan Tiao Chuan Kwa Chin Pu. Na Fantik Noithem No Mot Sikwan Kwan Joy Thuk Hien Hung Quoch Goi Jo. Hosio Leavenworth. Tiao Je Kwa Sienen Viet. Pelosi Kong Ko Kao Tra Loi Cho Kao Hoi Ve Thoi GM. Gai Kams NBC Kong Dan Dat Voi Su Hien Dien Kwe Gaber. Bang Chung Gai Ton He. Vikach Mo Hin Giao Dich Kwa Pelosi. Tong Tong Trump Jan Jung Tren Truth Social Luke Moy Hegyo Bon Moy Bay Put Chiu. Ju Tulsi Dat Tuyet Voi. Nancy Jan Bihui Diet. Jau Luat Pelosi Nen George Tong Kwa Ngay Lap Tuk. Ba Ai Jan Lua Gat Ngoy Dan Mai Hang Thapki. Moy Ngoy Jo Biet Gio Jo. Bai Gio Moy Ngoy Jo Tai. Bon. Van Fong Kwa Pelosi Jan Jua Ramot Tuyen Bo Luke Ba Gio Chiu. Ba Kao. Lan Lung. Hien Jiu Tran Hom Nay La Mot Kuok Tap Tran Ko Jong Ko Chin Tri Juoch Thiet Ke Jan La Chuong Hoin Hung Dat Bai Kwa Chin Quyen. Chutich Havien Dan Du Pelosi Ja Huan Tuan Tuan Tu Tat Ka Kech Yeu Kao Kong Khai Trong Suot Sung Hiep Kwa Min Va Se Tiep Tuk Ven Jong Chon Goi Dan San Francisco. Taile Van Hoila Taming Hin Train Mot. Lun Jiao Jang Dan Chu Jan To Chuk Mot Kwok. Hop Kankap Luke Bongio Chiu. Hakeem Jeffries Catherine Clark. Moithan Vian Lun Jiao Jo Tam Gia. Kwok Goi Keo Dai Moi Mot Foot. Jeffries Ja Juara Mot Tuyen Polux Bongioba Moi Foot. Kach Kao Buok Juok Juara Hom Naila Nhiem Trong Wakan Juok Jiu Tra Kiluang Boy Kach Kokwan Kotham Kwayen. Chung Toi Keo Goi Sumin Bach Vatrach Nhiem Giai Trin Huan Tuan Tutat Kakak Than Vien Kwok Hoi. Dich Nancy Pelosi Faitu Min So I So. Bang Hi Si Dan Chu Jan Bao Veho So Giao Dich Kwa Pelosi Trong Nhio Nam Jan Tu Choi Bin Luan. Moten Goi Thu Tu Noi Chuyen Voi Washington Post Duoi Dang Giao Ten. Noi. Kau Chuyen Ve Insulin Jan Giet Chet Chung Toi. Ban Hong de Giai Thich George Nam Trio Jo La Kimot Ngoi Lin Hong Ju Tien Mua Thuok. Jo Kong Fai La Mot Lap Luan Chin Sach. Jo La Mot Kwang Kao. Chung Toi Kong de Fat Song Kwang Kao Jo Cho Ba Ai Nua. Mot Ngoi Thu Nam Kung Doi Dang Giao Tin. Noi. Ba Ai Chi Kan Noi Rang Ba Ai Si Jat Moi Thu Vao Mot Qui Tin Thak Jok Lap. Jola Tat Kan Hungi Ba Ai Fai Lam. Chung Toi Jan Kao Shin Ba Ai. Trong Hiu Nam. An Ba Ai Se Hong Lam. Va Bai Gio Tat Ka Chung Ta Ju Fai Tragia. Thuong Ang Hisi Josh Hawley Jan To Chuk Mot Kwok Hop Bao Luk Nam Gio Chiu. Jiao Luat Pelosi Jan Ko Them Sao Ngoi Jong Bao Tro Ke Tu Fien Gio Tran. Ba Jang Vien Dan Chu Ba Jang Vien Kong Hoa. Giam Josh Gabbard, Jan Lam Jiu Gi Jo Hom, Nei Ma Chung Toi, Jako Gang Lam Trong Nhiu Nam. Antan Noi Ko A, Ja Hien Hong The Roy Mat. Thuong Ingi Si, Rick Scott, Ja Tweet Mot Kau. Buni Kiem Tuan Gao Bat Jiao Vao Ngai Mai. FBI Jan Juara Mot Tuyen, Boluk Sao Gio Chieu. Kuk Jang Sem Set Kach Tai Liu, Lien Quan Jen Kach Vi Pham Tiem, An Veluat Chung Hoan, Lien Bang Lien Quan Jen Kach Tan, Vien Kwok Hoi Hien Tai, Va Ku Tan Vien Kwok Hoi, Kung Gia Jin Ho. Say Kjang Kong Bo Mot Kwok Jiu Tra, Ngay lap tukve katmo hin giao dich ko tuong kwan voilich trin tom ta tong tin mat. Jen nua jem ba gio jat sai rama chua tang sai ra truok jai trong lich su chin tri mi. Jiao tien. Your kats giao dich chung koan, kuamot tan ha vien kwak hoi jang juong chuch jabi, FB ivage o giutra, jong thoi dua tren, bang chung juoch trin, bai trong mot, fien giutran kwa kwak hoi. Tu he, mot tan vien kwa chin jang kwa, chu tich ha vien jant kong khai fanjoy ba, ai tren truyen, hin truk tiep va xin loi ku tri vi ja ji theo su lan jao, kwa ba ai. Tu ba, tam tramang hen ngoi, mai jak sem, mot fien jiu tran, kwa ui ban truk tiep. Nihi u hon hao het kat chung, trin tin tuk trien hin kap tu hut trong mot tuan. Tulsi Gabbard, ja hakan taikan kulien hop Andrews toy home jo. Koi ai tu like seven ha, mot ngoin ha, hai pong nguo back Virginia. Abraham jang o fong kach. The now roy, so I jat tui sachlen kwe. Ko ai kong the giai tish moi bain gay. Ankthe joan clip jo o hap moi noi. Biet. Jien thoai kwa jan ta tu trua. Ko ai ngoi suong ban bep. Tap ho sovan kon trong tui sach kwa ko ai. O ko ai hong lei nora. Ko ai jagin ho kach konso. Hong fai gya ko fiu. Hong fai tilefantram. Mala hoangkash. Hoangkash kuyua, nhongi kwok hoi lira, pailam van nhongi no jantro than. By I goi emlamat fantram. Tulsi noi truok ki no bat jau truok mat moin goi. Iben noi rangem kongju tukach. Geo jo lam em kuchiu a. Hong. Geo lam em kuchiu la insulin. Kongai kwa keon kan bon tram, jo lamot thangva chong kwa Pelosi, kiem jok nam trieu jo la, chi trong mot gyao dich. Ko ain hin rangwai kwa so, jan juang bat sang tung kai mot. Ba ai jan o jo ba muoi tam nam abe. Va ba ai tu ba trio len hai tram tam muoi trio. Va suot thoi gian jo, moin guoi ju theo doi. Moin guoi ju biet. Va kong ai lam gi ke. Va bai gio, un kach kon, so jang juoch chieo tren si span. Va tuan hok kong, quan tam ban, quien luk jen muk nao. Please provide the Vietnamese text you would like me to rewrite.